Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on cost management documents. The cost management documents are organized into two broad categories. Those that are part of the project management plan include the cost management plan, the cost baseline, and the performance measurement baseline. Other project documents include the cost estimates, the basis of estimates, and cost forecasts. The cost management plan describes how the project costs will be estimated, budgeted, managed, monitored, and controlled. It is your rule book for how you're going to manage costs and plan for costs in your project. It does not include any of the specific costs of the project, however. Those are included in the cost baseline, which is part of the project management plan, but not part of the cost management plan. However, your cost management plan should include the appropriate control thresholds, which should be typically expressed as a percentage variance from your cost baseline. For example, in your organization and for your project, you may decide that if the costs look like they're going to be or are trending to be more than 5% over budget, then that's your tolerance, and at that point, you take some action. Exactly how this is measured should be detailed in your cost management plan. The contents of your cost management plan are similar to the contents of your schedule management plan, just for costs this time instead of schedule. It begins with a description of the cost estimating techniques that you will use on your project. There are many techniques that we will come to when we get to the tools and techniques for cost management planning, and those should be specified here in the cost management plan. It should also specify the units of measure. This is usually in terms of money, but not necessarily. It may be in other units, such as staff hours or days or weeks of time, measures that are based on time. It could be also based on other quantity measures, such as meters or kilometers or cubic yards or any other sort of measurement. But typically, it is in terms of money. But it should specify which money. Is this in dollars, US dollars, Australian dollars, Hong Kong dollars, British pounds, European euros? What exactly is the unit of measure that will be used throughout this project? This is where you will also specify your level of precision, meaning how will you round the numbers? Will you be rounding them to the nearest penny, or the nearest dollar, or the nearest $1,000? Also, the level of accuracy is stored in this document, which is basically the acceptable range of your estimates. Plus or minus 10% or plus or minus 5%. Whatever that level of accuracy or acceptable range is should be specified in this document so that all estimates are consistent throughout the project. As with the schedule management plan, here in the cost management plan, your estimates should be linked to the framework of the work breakdown structure, specifically using the control accounts. Remember when we discussed the WBS, the control accounts are those points or nodes within the work breakdown structure hierarchy at which cost and schedule information is rolled up and measured so that you can compare your baseline plan to your actuals. You should specify which rules of performance measurement you'll be using, if you're using earned value management, and if so, how you'll be using those. You'll also have here, of course, your control thresholds to specify at what point you need to take action if the project costs are going off track. These rules and thresholds should also specify over what period you are measuring these items. For example, are you going to raise a red flag if a particular phase is out of control, but the project overall is still doing fine? Your cost management reports should be defined here ahead of time, the formats you'll use and how frequently you'll send them out. You should also include information about your funding choices. Where will your funding come from? How will you account for any fluctuations in exchange rates between countries' currencies? And what will be your procedure for recording project costs? This cost management plan could be very short and summary level, just a couple of pages long, or it could be quite long and detailed. This will depend on your organization and the needs of the project. Many of the rules for cost management may come from your organization, from your program or portfolio or your PMO. Your cost estimates are the quantitative assessments of the probable costs of the project. These assessments are quantitative, meaning that there's a specific number that you come up with for each estimate, usually in the form of currency, but not necessarily. It's an assessment, meaning you've spent some time doing some analysis and using some different techniques to come up with what you think are your best estimates. And also notice the word probable. These estimating techniques are naturally uncertain. Your estimates will have built into them a certain amount of uncertainty and should be expressed using some ranges of probability or uncertainty. In addition to estimating the costs of all of the work packages and activities involved in your project, you will also want to include contingency funds and management reserves in your cost estimates. Also make sure that you include all of the factors that will affect your project costs. These include both direct and indirect costs. Your project will certainly include direct costs, but depending on the guidelines of your organization, may or may not include indirect costs. Direct costs will include direct labor and materials involved in your project. Also the costs of acquiring or leasing or using equipment, any services that you'll need, the use of facilities, as well as any of the hardware and software and other information technology required for your project. And don't forget to also consider the cost of financing. There may be certain costs involved in acquiring the money and financing you need for your project. You may need to also account for inflation depending on how long the project will go and the environment or economy that your project is operating in. And if your project involves multiple currencies, you'll need to consider exchange rates and how those may change over time. The rules for how to manage any of these changes should be included in your cost management plan. Suppose that your software development team is working in a shared office space with hundreds of other employees. The cost of that office space, whether it's owned or whether it's leased, there'll be certain costs involved, such as the rent or lease cost and the cost of the electricity and the heating and any other utilities, maintenance of the building, safety, all of those sorts of costs that are for the building as a whole can be applied to your project as indirect costs. If you're a team of 10 people and you've got an office with 200 people in it, then 5% of that office's cost could be applied to your project. You may also have other overhead charges to your project. Suppose your organization has a project management office and an HR department that serve your project indirectly, along with all of the other teams in your organization. A portion of their costs could be applied to your project as indirect costs. As you can see, figuring out all of these indirect costs can take a little bit of time and effort. Whether or not your organization applies indirect costs to projects depends on your organization and how they measure and manage these indirect costs. Let's explore contingency reserves and management reserves. Contingency reserves are time or money that is allocated in a schedule or cost baseline for known risks with active response strategies. Management reserves are amounts in the project budget or project schedule that is reserved for unforeseen work that is within the scope of the project. Contingency reserves can be either in the cost or schedule baseline, so this could be extra money or extra time, but it's specifically for known risks that have active response strategies. As we go through risk planning and risk management, we'll identify several different risks and decide how to respond to those risks. Our response to those risks may include allocating some additional time or money, either as a buffer or for specific activities that we need to do in order to avoid or mitigate those risks. This amount of money or time that we've allocated is what is known as the contingency reserve. This could be for things as simple as being concerned about estimates being a little bit overly optimistic. So you may decide to add 10 or 20% to your cost estimate as a buffer, or 10 or 20% to your schedule estimate, also for a buffer in case things take a little bit longer or cost a little bit more than you expected. Whatever the reason, if you decide to put in some kind of a buffer like this, this is the contingency reserve. The management reserve, on the other hand, is for other things that have not been identified as risks, things that could go wrong that you haven't even thought of yet. But it does have to be within the scope of the project. So management reserves will not cover or should not be used to cover increases in scope. If you have a change request where someone wants to add some feature or something to your project, that's new scope. It's not within the existing scope of the project. So that new scope should be evaluated. And if that change request is approved, then additional funding should be provided for that additional scope, and it should not come from the management reserve. The management reserve is more for surprises that you hadn't planned for, and it's not included in the baseline, but it is included in the project budget. Suppose, for example, you have planned for the possibility that you could lose a team member on your project team, and that indeed you do. The money and time from the contingency reserves could be used to then find and hire a new person and bring them up to speed on your project. But what happens if you lose a second team member and you hadn't planned for that? The additional amount of time and money that you need for bringing up to speed your second team member could come from the management reserve, as this was unforeseen work, but it is within the scope of the project. Or even worse, what if you lose one of your key stakeholders, a key user, or even your project sponsor, and they need to be replaced with someone else who needs time to come up to speed, and you need to spend time and money helping them come up to speed on the project. This could also come, or should also come, from the management reserves. Your project's cost baseline is the approved version of the time-phased project budget, excluding any management reserves. Notice that this is time-phased, meaning that it shows how the budget is applied over time, how much budget you need each month or each quarter, and so on. Once it's been baselined, your cost baseline can only be changed by following your project's formal change control procedures, because this cost baseline will be used as the basis for comparing the planned costs to your actual costs. Now, as you have changes to your project, those change requests will go through your change control process, and if they're approved, there should be additional money allocated to cover those costs. As a result, your cost baseline will be changed, but only through approved change requests. Here's how the project budget stacks up. It starts with activity cost estimates, which you can see here on the right, which are estimates for each individual activity. Each activity doesn't necessarily need to, but can have a contingency reserve specifically for that activity. If it does, those contingency reserves should be clearly identified and not just hidden or buried in the activity cost estimate. It should be quite clear how much of the estimate is the estimate itself and how much is the contingency reserve for that estimate. Those are then added up to the work package level to provide the work package cost estimates. Here, also at this level, the work packages can have contingency reserves. But again, they should be clearly marked so that it's quite clear how much is the cost estimate for the work package and how much is the contingency reserve for that work package. All of these work package cost estimates then add up at certain points in the work breakdown structure that we discussed earlier, which are called the control accounts. The work breakdown structure will probably have several different control accounts that are collections of different work packages. These are points at which you apply earned value analysis to measure the performance for different areas of the work breakdown structure. This would allow you to measure performance for and compare performance between different phases of your project or for different types of costs, such as people versus equipment, vendors, or materials. You can measure performance on these separately if you choose, or you could measure your performance for different major deliverables, such as if you have a project to build a road and a bridge, you could compare the performance of building the road to the performance of building the bridge. Or you could have it by different teams, or different locations, or even different approaches so that you could compare those parts of the project that are predictive against those that are more agile or hybrid. These control accounts can provide you with a great deal of flexibility and control in measuring the performance of your project. All of these control accounts then add up to the entire scope of the work breakdown structure, which becomes your cost baseline. This is the part that is baselined and cannot be changed without going through your formal change control process. However, notice that your management reserve is not included in your cost baseline, but it is added to your cost baseline to form the full project budget. Here you have a time-phased project budget. This time-phased diagram shows time along the horizontal axis at the bottom, progressing from left to right. You can see the cost baseline in the middle, which shows over time how much you are planning to spend on the project. You can see this starts off slowly and then accelerates and then tapers off a little bit. And it has a slight S curve to it, so it's often referred to as an S-curve diagram. Notice also that the funding doesn't necessarily happen all at once. You don't necessarily get all of your project budget at the very start of the project, especially if this is a longer project that is going to take several years. You don't want to pull all of your funding out of longer-term investments at the very beginning. You want to pull it out as you need it. So here you can see this stair-step type of increase where your funding increases and you get a little bit more at key points along the way. In fact, they probably should be tied to key milestones in your project where you can verify at phase gates that you have been able to accomplish what you need, and you decide at your phase gate whether to proceed and how to proceed with the project. At that point, you could get the additional funding that you need for the next phase. When you forecast your project costs to determine how much you think the project is going to cost, this may and usually will be a little bit different than your cost baseline. And this new estimate of total project costs is known as the estimate at completion. Now, your estimate at completion can be calculated using earned value analysis, which uses past performance to predict how future performance will go on your project. Or you could calculate your estimate at completion by redoing your calculations from the bottom up and adding it all up together. This is where your basis of estimates would come in handy. We have several lessons specifically on earned value analysis. However, at a high level, it simply is based on the idea that if your project has been under budget, for example, and you expect that it will continue to be under budget, then earned value analysis will help you to quantify exactly how much under budget you think the project will be. The same for schedule. If you've been ahead of schedule, it will allow you to quantify how far ahead of schedule you believe you'll be. And it helps you to separate and manage separately your costs and your schedule, and to see clearly where a project is headed. The performance measurement baseline is an integration of your scope, schedule, and cost baselines that is used for earned value analysis. It's measured in money, and you can think of it as an integrated baseline of how long you expect it will take to complete certain scopes of work based on your control accounts, and what these scopes of work will cost. In this lesson, we've provided an overview of the cost management plan, which specifies how costs will be planned, structured, and controlled. We've discussed cost estimates, including contingency and management reserves, as well as direct and indirect costs. The basis of estimates, which is important if we ever need to review or redo our estimates. The cost baseline, which is the approved costs for the budget. The concept of a time-phased budget to represent our funding requirements. And we briefly introduced earned value, which allows us to do cost forecasts as well as schedule forecasts, and which uses the performance measurement baseline. For more information, you can see these pages of the PMBOK guide. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.